Hello and welcome to Conflict Confidential. This is your host, Jonathan. Welcome to the podcast that unveils untold stories and reveals lesser known information of conflicts from recent history and ongoing clashes. Join me on a journey through lesser known conflicts, shedding light on the hidden struggles that have shaped and are shaping our world right now. From forgotten acts of crimes against humanity to suppressed uprisings, we delve deep into the heart of these narratives, revealing the facts and human experiences behind the headlines. Immerse yourself in the intricate web of tensions, the clash of ideologies, and the pursuit of resolution. So, Conflict Confidential is your gateway to understanding the world's most intriguing and underreported battles, sparking conversations that transcend borders. Tune in and unravel the secrets of conflict as we look at diverse perspectives, humanitarian concerns, indirect geopolitical implications, and media bias and information gaps. On this episode, we looked at an event that would be called as the prelude to one of the most tragic events in human history, the Holocaust. So, the reason why I decided to name this as the Prelude to Holocaust is as we go through this podcast, listening to different events and incidents that happen. For those of you who are already familiar with the crime that happened in the Second World War, it will reveal to you striking similarities between this event and the one that happened after it. So, this was an event that had all the evil practices that were employed at the concentration camps by Germany during the Second World War. It almost feels like a small scale trial that was carried out and then was employed a couple of decades later on a larger scale. We are talking about the first genocide of the 20th century, the Namibian Genocide. So, what is a genocide? To put it in simple terms, it would be the intentional destruction of a group of people in whole or in part. It could be people belonging to a particular ethnicity, religion, culture, language group, or more. And genocides usually have three stages. I mean, different people have given different arguments for multiple stages, but it can be basically grouped into three, where it starts with dehumanization, wherein a difference is created in a society as to us versus them, where them are considered as people not humans or not at par with us, and then gradually they are dehumanized in a systematic way through media, through education, through different narratives, and that idea, once it sets in the general populace, takes us to the next step, the second step, which is extermination. And just like the word says, it is exterminating people. It's not even like a figure of speech, but just killing people off in a systematic and planned way so as to maximize the kills. And finally, it culminates with the third step, which is denial, wherein the perpetrators fail to acknowledge the crimes they have done, or it is erased from public memory. So these are the three steps you could say that happens in a genocide. So now, as we move on to understand this particular genocide we are talking about, the Namibian genocide. So Namibia as a country is situated in the west coast of southern Africa, between Angola in the north, South Africa in the south, and Botswana to the east. It's bordered by the Atlantic Ocean to the west. And the country was formerly known as Southwest Africa. And it is also the second least densely populated country in the world. So the first is Mongolia, and this comes after that. And the country gained independence in the year 1990, not so long ago. And so until it got independence, it was ruled by the colonial powers of Germany and South Africa for about 106 years. Fun fact here, If you are a movie aficionado, then the Mad Max movie, the new one where Tom Hardy acted, most of those scenes were filmed here in this country. So if you watch the movie, you have a fair idea that a lot of the topography in this country is desert like with not so much vegetation and water resources. And as we go on, we see how this affected the outcome of the genocide and the conflict as well. And the pre colonial history is not really well documented. And when we look at the colonial history, which is when this thing began, it began with the advance of the first colonial settlers from Europe when there was an unprecedented wave of intervention of Europeans in Africa. It is called today as the scramble for Africa. That's the term we use, especially in the academia. And it was when the partition and conquest of Africa by Europeans happened in the late 19th century. And towards the end of the 19th century, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck declares Namibia, which is formerly known as Southern or Southwestern Africa, a German colony for trade and settlement. I mean, other colonial powers who were stronger at that time, like the British, um, they really didn't show much interest to that area there, and you could even say they let the Germans have it because they did not see any economic value in that part of the region. And yeah, so just like how the Germans took hold of southwestern Africa, King Leopold of Belgium took hold of Congo, and France claimed West Africa. And the colonial presence began with the arrival of the missionaries first, and then merchants started arriving, and then finally, of course, soldiers. Because once you have mercantile interest and there's money involved, you want to protect your assets, and then you have soldiers coming in. And here's an interesting fact as well. So, the region or the country has many tribes, different tribes. And this genocide was particularly committed against the two most powerful tribal groups in that region, called as the Nama and Herero. And initially, when some explorers set foot in the area along the west coast, they believed this region to be rich in wildlife resources. So they were looking for ivory and exotic animals. So they introduced firearms for the local people there, so they could efficiently hunt and capture these animals. And that started to infiltrate into intertribal conflicts, creating large scale violence as well. Yeah, so coming back to the topic, the presence of Germans were initially tolerated by the natives there because they were seen as being mediators between these different warring tribes. And once after gaining influence, the Germans wanted the lands that people had, and these tribals, their main source of sustenance was they were cattle herders. So, like we saw before, the place was not so rich in vegetation and water resources, so they needed a lot of land so that they could take animals from one grazing area to another. And naturally, when if you're taking the land away from them, it means you're also taking the livelihood away from them, because then they can no longer feed and take care of their animals. So they wanted these people, especially the Herreros, the Germans wanted them to give them the lands, and the Germans wanted them to be pushed into reservations. And of course, they refused to sign it. I mean, any people group would do that. Someone coming to your own country where you've been living for hundreds of thousands of years and dictating terms forcibly, that's unacceptable. And then these conflicts led to an uprising when an Herero group attacked a farming settlement, and they destroyed homes, the railroad there, and also they killed several farmers. And There was orders explicitly given by the leader of this Herero group not to kill any women, children, and missionaries. So most of the people killed were men, if not all of them. And when Berlin received this news, the King of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm, he was really angry. And one of the reasons that he was extremely angry with this was he did not really see Africans as humans. They were seen as, you could say, subhumans or part humans and part animals. Like, he didn't see them as humans, so it was kind of humiliating for him to see like the German army being defeated by people who are not even humans or people who are not civilized. So he had the same attitude for the Asians as well when he was suppressing or when he was facing the Boxer rebellion, that he considered those people not as humans but as subhumans. And he assigned a lieutenant general called as Lothar von Trotha, who initially had a big hand in suppressing the Boxer rebellions, and he was known for using extreme methods. So he was sent by the king to southwestern Africa to call this revolt. And the general von Trotha, as soon as he arrived, he issued an extermination order where he no longer even was willing to accept prisoners. He said, it doesn't matter if you have arms and weapons or not. If we find you, we kill you. It doesn't matter. And most of these people were forced to run into the desert. And from the desert, some escaped into British controlled Botswana, where they were hunted and killed, like here. And the German troops started to systematically eliminate people belonging to the group. There were instances where the troops would surround a village and women and children and men were taken out of their homes forcibly and shot dead. So terrible things were happening. And the people who tried to flee, of course, they had to face the desert. And once they ran into the desert, the borders and the exit points were again sealed or manned by Germans. So they just had to starve and die without water. Also, the crazy thing is the Germans also poisoned some of these wells that were source of drinking water, which is considered even as a war crime back then. And years later, in the Second World War, the Germans employed the same tactic when they were poisoning wells in France in the First World War. So the survivors then, in a twisted act of rationality, or you could say um, a logical reasoning, they realized, or at least one of them realized, that instead of killing all these people, we could use them as laborers, like forced human laborers, without paying them, and just keeping them like slaves, and that could benefit the German colony economically because they were better suited to the climate there. They know the place there, so they could survive. And so then they decided, okay, like, we are not going to kill these people anymore. Let's start using them as laborers for our economic purposes. And that's when it happens. Concentration camps started to get built. Now we see a lot of things that we see later in the Holocaust. So the camps are built and people are put into there where they live in inhuman conditions. There's no sanitation, they don't have enough space, they're not given enough food, there's rampant starvation. People are given uncooked rice, salt, and water. I mean, yeah. So, and the mortality in some of these concentration camps went up to 80%. So for the people group who were original inhabitants of that place, if they are facing such an high mortality rate, then we can really get an idea of how terrible the conditions must have been. This resulted in the death of around 65,000 Hereros and around 10,000 Namas. So 80% of Hereros were the tribe belonging people belonging to Herero tribe. 80% of them were wiped out, and almost 50% of the Nama were wiped out. And as if this wasn't enough evilness or wickedness, something else was happening here consequently as well. Is The Germans here practiced eugenics. I mean, some of you must have heard this term. For some of you, it must be new. So, what is eugenics? So, eugenics is a science where people try to improve the genetic quality of humans, or it is also termed by racial improvement by people as well. It's a very, very controversial topic because a lot of practices that have been employed under this field has resulted in terrible crimes against humanity. So there was one really well-known doctor who was working in these camps, who was doing medical studies, so-called medical studies, where he, in some instances or many instances, what he did was he would find these prisoners in the concentration camps who are suffering from scurvy, and they would be forcibly injected with arsenic and opium. Like, the people didn't know what they were injected with, but they were being intentionally injected by these people to see the effects of what it does to them. And of course, it kills them, and after they die, autopsies were performed on them. And there's one instance of it being mentioned where the doctor is really happy to receive fresh corpses every day. That's how twisted things were. Like, he was excited to see fresh dead people. And a lot of skulls from these dead people, the skulls were sent back to Germany to further study them by scientists there, because they wanted to prove this idea that they were a superior race, like Germans were a superior race, far advanced in development, and they wanted to prove it using biological means. That's what he was trying to do. And it's crazy to know that even in the Second World War, during the Holocaust, there were terrible experiments being performed, like twins were forcibly cut and joined together, and different crazy things. If you go through it, most of it is honestly disturbing. So why I'm bringing that here is this doctor in the concentration camps here, Eugen Fischer. He then goes back to Germany and he lives up to around 92 years old. So he was kind of never held accountable for his actions. He goes back to Germany, and during the Second World War, he joins the Nazi Party, and he also starts to teach in universities at that time. And one of his student, becomes the teacher of this doctor we know as Joseph Mengele, who is also called the Angel of Death. So we can see how this one person and the crimes he committed didn't only stop with him, but also influenced the generation after him and the generation after that as well. And even Hitler, when he was in prison before his rise to power, he got hold of a book that was written by this guy, Eugen Fischer. And that's when he also started to believe and develop his theory of the racial superiority of what he called the Germans as Aryans. So we can see how this, in a way, resulted in another humanity or human calamity taking place on a much larger scale. And so finally, how did this genocide end? It ended in around 1907, when the war started to become unpopular back at home. So, since there was no support from home, they decided to end the war and shut down concentration camps. And even after the decision was made to shut down these camps, it took almost an year to shut down the last of these camps. So even after the war was officially declared as over, people were still being held in camps and killed for another year. It was officially declared as over on the 31st of March in 1907, the war which began in 1904. And this was recognized as a genocide only in 1985 by the UN. And for Germans, it took many more years until they officially recognized this as a genocide in 2021. So, what was the aftermath? The Germans decided to pay some kind of compensation for the atrocities that were committed by people before them, and they decided to pay an amount of 1.1 billion euros as compensation, which would be systematically given to the government there over years. That is, just like chump change for the kind of work they did. And this is also still not acceptable to the descendants of the people who are living there, the Namas and Hereros, because firstly, it is being given to the Namibian government. So the government then decides how it's going to allocate it to those people and what kind of projects they would use it for. So it could be said that the people who it is deemed for, they don't really have a say in how to use it. And this is also an interesting case because this can be a test case for future negotiations of countries that were formerly colonies of other big powers like France, Britain, or Portugal, because they too can demand reparations for the amount of loot and plundering they had to go through under these formerly colonial powers. And so, what does the reconciliation really require? Firstly, it requires acknowledgement and accountability, like acknowledging it in a public space, like even within the educational system in Germany, like the colonial history was not always so glorious, or how they try to portray it like they're going and civilizing people in Asia or Africa, you know. So that mentality has to be removed, where even in textbooks, students start learning like this is something that is part of the history that they did, and it was not right. And it also, restorative justice has to take place. Justice doesn't just mean paying some amount, it really has to rectify the blunders that were created and the intergenerational effects that's being passed down and seen in those two people groups right now. And finally, the decolonization of historical narratives will have to happen. As someone said, history, is written by the victors. So both sides of the story needs to be told and written of what really went on there. And it's only fair because those people who lost their lives were humans just like us. And this can be a lesson for future generations as well, because those who don't know history, as the famous saying goes, are deemed to repeat it. So those are the lessons and legacies that we can take away from what we have spoken about this particular genocide so far. So thank you for joining me on this episode. This tragic event teaches us the significance of acknowledging past atrocities and seeking accountability. And it reminds us the utmost importance of upholding human rights and respecting the dignity of every individual. So, as we conclude, let us carry these lessons forward, embracing empathy and compassion, bridging divides, and learning from the past to shape a harmonious future. So, join me next time on Conflict Confidential as we continue to unveil the stories that can guide us towards a more peaceful and compassionate world. Remember, understanding lesson on conflicts is key to building a brighter tomorrow. Thanks for joining. See you soon.